Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2014 last lecture at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. We're delighted to see this terrific turnout this afternoon and thank you for your attendance at this special event. This is the fourth year of the last lecture at UNCP. I'm pleased to note that in a very short time, this event's become a welcome and anticipated tradition on our campus. It's important to note that the last lecture is a student-driven event, and as such, it calls to our students to determine the honoree each year. The prompt for nominations is straightforward. What faculty member would you most like to hear address the following question? If this were your last time to address a group of students, what would you say to them? A selection committee chaired by student Darian Duvall reviewed many nominations and ultimately selected Dr. Jeff Frederick as this year's last lecture award honoree. Dr. Frederick joined the UNCP family in 2003 and is currently associate professor in the Department of History. He holds both a bachelor's degree and an MA from the University of Central Florida and a PhD from Auburn University. His academic interests involve around Southern political history and civil rights. Dr. Frederick is widely published and received national acclaim for his 2007 biography of Governor George Wallace entitled Stand Up for Alabama. Dr. Frederick has received several awards throughout his career in academia, including 2 UNCP Athletic Faculty Appreciation Teaching Awards and 2 Personal Touch Appreciation Awards. He's also been involved in outreach and service projects both on the UNCP campus and throughout Robeson County. Dr. Frederick gives freely of his time to work with and advocate for our students. Nowhere is this more evident than in his 8 years of service as UNCP's faculty athletic representative. We're very proud of Dr. Frederick's work and honored to recognize him as one of our own. At this time, I will ask Ms. Darian Duvall to come to the podium to share some additional information regarding Dr. Frederick's nomination and selection for this year's award. Dr. Frederick will speak at the conclusion of Ms. Duvall's remarks. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm Darian Duvall. I am a freshman with a double major in business and political science. So the process for our choice for Dr. Frederick for the last lecture, it was kind of different. He is actually my professor this current semester, but whenever nominations started, it was first semester, so I didn't have it. During the nomination process, I saw his name come up a few times, and I read the reviews about him. I was like, oh, this guy must be pretty great. Well, it goes to be time to register for my classes, and I found out I have to take history. So I sign up, and I see his name. I was like, well, he must be good, so I'm going to take this class. I get in there, and history is a subject I absolutely hate. And I go in there and I hear this man making all kinds of history just come alive and makes it exciting. And his class is turning into one of my favorite classes now. It's something I look forward to going into, and he really deserves this award, and I know he's going to do a great job. The way I told Dr. Frederick about him winning the last lecture award, it was on a piece of notebook paper, so it's kind of a funny story. I told him one day, I was like, I want to meet with you. I want to meet after class, and I want us to go over some of my notes to see if I'm taking, accurate notes, if I'm going to do good on the test and stuff. And right before I walked in, I wrote on a piece of paper, I was like, congratulations, you're this year's last lecture award winner. And so I gave him my notebook. I was like, I want you to go through my notes and see, if I'm missing anything or how everything's going. And he gets to the page and he looks at it, and I see his face light up, and he looks up at me. And I look down and all I can do is start getting my hand emotional. I got really emotional, and I thought he was going to do the same thing. I was like, he smiled at me, and I asked him, like, are you going to accept this job to take on the last lecture this year? And he was like, yes, I will. And I could tell by then, whenever I awarded him that, his enthusiasm was just, it was phenomenal. And I knew from then on that he was going to do an amazing job. And just sitting in his class on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, 9 in the morning, just hearing him and hearing how he reaches out and how he touches children, like our students and everything, it's amazing. And on behalf of, if Dr. Frederick wants to come, on behalf of the Student Government Association, we would like to award you this plaque for this year's last lecture.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's an honor to be asked to give the 2014 last lecture. I've got a simple goal for the next 45 minutes. That is, first of all, to keep you awake, which I hope to be able to do. 2, to talk about a couple of things that matter to me and hopefully will matter to you as well. And 3, to do everything I can not to publicly embarrass myself. The best way to start today is to say thanks. And I want to thank, first of all, my family. Thanks to my father and mother, Terry and Marilyn, to my brother John and his wife Betsy and their children Zach, Travis and Ethan, my sister Jackie and her husband Brad, their children Nathan and Jocelyn, my in-laws Gary and Marilyn, their son Chris, his wife Cindy, and kids Dylan and Hunter, and Ben, his wife Christy, and their daughters Coral and Kaylin. I want to thank all of them. But most specifically, I want to offer very special thanks to my wife Melinda, to my boys Logan and Jack and Quentin. More on them later, probably much to their chagrin and embarrassment. I also should say that I owe a debt of gratitude to everybody who ever took an interest in me. Everybody who thought there might be something in me worth refining. I owe a debt of gratitude to friends and to neighbors, friends who drove long distances to come see me today. I owe a debt of gratitude to coaches and teachers, to co-workers, to professors. I owe a debt of gratitude to other scholars, and I certainly owe more than a little debt of gratitude to my colleagues in the history department. One of the jewels of this university, and no finer group of colleagues could I work with. Now, this is an interesting picture. There's a couple of people missing, and I'm going to point them out just because they're not in the picture. Dr. Weston Cook, who is not in the picture, and he was recently named the winner of the coveted Board of Governors Teaching Award. And Janet Gentis, who is our administrative assistant, and who, if you ask anyone in the history department, who really makes all the trains run on time, it's her. She's not in the picture either and deserves to be. And so I want to make mention of them especially. My colleagues in the history department challenge each of us to continue to work on our teaching, to make our scholarship important, and service. There's no finer group of people to work with, and I'm in debt to all of them. I'm in debt to the rest of the accumulated faculty and staff of this university as well, who overwhelmingly have the mission of taking care of students here and trying to be good at the things that they want to be good at. I have a debt of gratitude to plenty of folks in Florida, in Alabama, and here in North Carolina who have inspired me, who have offered some appreciation for what I've been trying to do, and particularly have helped me to understand more of the critical elements of life in the South, which is what I spend my time thinking about and writing about. Now, in addition to these groups of people we've talked about, there's one more group that needs to be specially mentioned before I get into the nuts and bolts of what I intend to say today, and that is my students. Undergraduate and graduate who tolerate me, who are willing participants in the many reindeer games I end up playing with them. The dirty little secret about this place is that professors, when they're paying attention, and we usually try, we learn just as much from our students as we ever hope to tell them. And so I'm grateful to my students for their interest, for their questions, for their curiosity, and for the way in which they constantly seek to help us see things from a somewhat different perspective. Now, hopefully my students who are here today weren't too busy texting or tweeting to hear that. But a big thank you to them. Randy Pausch is the person most responsible for the concept of the last lecture. Randy Pausch was a computer scientist who did much of his best work at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is one of the premier engineering and computing schools in the country. Pausch was a researcher and a passionate teacher, one who pushed his students and enjoyed the give and take with them. Pausch encouraged his students to be better than they thought they could be. And he worked tirelessly to that end. Pausch was married with 3 children and contracted pancreatic cancer. finding little relief from the various treatments that he underwent. In the early fall of 2007, he delivered what became known as the last lecture, purportedly a series of life lessons that he wanted to impart to his colleagues and his students. Tragically, less than a year after he delivered his last lecture, Randy Pausch was dead. And ironically, there is a clear line between Pausch and myself, believe it or not. My father, Terry Frederick, is a computer scientist, and he knew Pausch. The two having visited on a few occasions when my dad brought him to the University of Central Florida where he worked in order that Pausch might interact with his colleagues and with his students. Pausch's last lecture was characterized by two key ideas. One pretty obvious and one a little bit more covert. The main theme of Pausch's lecture was about pursuing your dreams. And Pausch went into some detail about examining the dreams that he had and the, generally speaking, excellent progress that he had made towards achieving them. The second part of Pausch's lecture was what he called the head fake, something he described as pretending to be doing one thing when actually he was doing something different. Pausch's main head fake was the idea that his last lecture was really not just intended to partake nuggets to his colleagues and his students, but to partake in the process of sharing lifelong lessons to his 3 children. Now, the truth about professors is probably interesting and worth acknowledging. We have probably earned a bit of a reputation for being a little more absent-minded than we might ought to be. At the very least, we've developed a reputation for sometimes obsessing so much over the details that matter so much to us individually that we lose some of the big picture. We might be accused every once in a while of not finding the main idea. Kind of like the story about a preacher who invited a professor to go out fishing on a large lake. And the two of them went out onto a lake together and spent some time together. And then all of a sudden, the professor, absent-mindedly, dropped one of the oars out into the water and saw it float away. The preacher said it would be okay. And the preacher bowed his head and he started to pray. And after a minute of solitude, the preacher stepped up out of the boat, literally walked across the water, grabbed the oar, turned around and walked back and got back into the boat. Well, the next day, one of the professor's colleagues at the university asked him if he'd enjoyed going fishing with the preacher. The professor said, well, you know, it was okay, but would you believe that guy can't even swim? He kind of lost the main idea. Well, us professors, we can be accused of missing some important stuff, but on balance, I would say to you is we're a little bit more like ordinary folk than our worst critics realize. We're a little bit more normal than some people might imagine. And so with that, I plan to attack today's central question. If this were your last time to address a group of students, what would you say to them? What would be the thing you would want them to hold on to more than anything else? And that's my plan today, to make 3 points. 3 points about what I would like any of my students to know if it was the last moment I ever had with them. The first point would be for them to find out who they are. To find out who they are. Historians like me spend a lot of time talking about issues of identity. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out who people are. We spend some time trying to figure out how people have decided over time to determine their destiny. What mattered to them. Why they spent their time the way they did. And we think about in what ways society champions your ability to become who you want to be. Or, from another perspective, we think about the ways in which society limits ordinary people of all kinds of different stripes from figuring out who they want to be. Now, we have identified lots of different potential answers to these questions of identity. Your identity to some people over time came from understanding concepts like blood quantum or your ethnic heritage. What is your social class? How critical was that to determining who you are and who you wanted to be? Obviously, race and racial identity for a Southern historian like me is very prominent. Gender is certainly a concept that has evolved over time as people have figured out what it means to be male or what it means to be female in a variety of different ways. Your ideology is important for determining your identity. Maybe even your religion or your worldview, sometimes called your mentalite. Certainly sexual identity is an issue for historians to consider as well. And something that some folks refer to as hyphenation, the sort of bifurcated or composite identity we have over time. The fact that we grab little bits of what we want to become and we add to it, that we're constantly in changing, that we're more than just one thing. This concept of hyphenation, I think, is pretty noteworthy because at any given moment we can be a lot of different things for different reasons. Our poverty can affect who we're going to be. Our health and our access to health care historically has determined some of the ways in which we've identified who we are. Our experiences, our hobbies, our sense of self, our sense of ideology. So many different things can be critical to understanding where identity comes from. And part of what Southern historians have determined is that we have our own set of regional identities that have come from a life lived in the South. Over the fullness of Southern history, from the colonial period through today, I can say this about Southerners. Disproportionately, we're poorer than any other group of Americans. We make less money for a whole set of important historical reasons. Disproportionately, we're more likely to be undereducated over time, also for a variety of reasons. We're more religious, mostly than any other group of Americans, most often embracing evangelical Christianity. But that term can mean a lot of different things as well. Historically, we're more violent than any other group of Americans. And any number of sources, including FBI information, will tell us that. We're rural. In many ways more rural, though not the only group of Americans that are certainly rural. We're country folk. We lay claim to that heritage. We don't apologize for it. We live with a concept that there's a certain place, a certain geographical place, where life makes more sense to us. A sense of place, a calling, sometimes unfairly, but a calling that sends us back to one particular geography, one particular hometown, one particular plot of family land. We're less likely to vote, historically, for many reasons, not the least of which is disfranchisement of minorities and of poor folks. We do family a little different here in the South. That's part of our identity, too. And some of that is good, and some of that is bad, and some of that is ugly. And we all have plenty of examples of all of that. We're also, our identity as Southerners over time, we're traditional. We find ourselves doing the same thing for no apparent reason other than continuity. How many of you have eaten the exact same thing at Thanksgiving ever since you achieved the ability to know what you were eating? We do things for no apparent reason other than just, well, it's the way we've always done things. Which leads us to the concept that we're generally pretty uninterested in change as Southerners. Part of our identity is to stay static, to conserve what we've always had, as opposed to look for much else. And of course, it's fair to say we have lived historically in a pretty pressurized region. Pressurized over ideas about race, most of which have been pretty unfortunate, pressurized about ideas of religion, some of which have been comforting, some of which have not, and pressurized over concepts of gender, which have certainly limited the ability of some people to answer the simple question, what do I want for my life? And yet there are even other things. We as Southerners are great at consuming fried food. We'll put virtually anything in oil and cook it up and then eat it and then talk about how we cooked it and talk about how we ate it. We're pretty hospitable, all things being considered. In fact, if you're going to have a flat tire, you're better off having a flat tire in the South also statistically pretty unlikely to travel, because that sense of place tells us there's somewhere where you belong. Get where you belong and stay there. As individuals, what I would say to you, in a free society in the 21st century, we have a greater opportunity to define for ourselves who we are and what we want to be than at any time in American history. I would say to you that in the 21st century, while we're far from perfect, we're freer today than we've ever been. And that's a good thing. What that means is that your identity is something that you can decide for yourself more today than at any other time in American history. You get to pick what matters to you. And you generally get to do what you want. You might have to summon some strength to decide what you want to be. It might not be easy to declare to the world who you are and what you value and what you're supposed to be. But you need to do it. You need to answer the fundamental question of who are you? You get to do that for yourself here. We're going to encourage that. If you don't decide for yourself, here's the problem. Somebody else will decide for you. Somebody will tell you what you value. Somebody will tell you how to spend your life. Someone will tell you who you should be, when in fact, your identity is something you control. And if you don't decide for yourself, there will be ramifications. So who am I? And how did I find this out? Well, I would say that there's a list of things that describe me that I've determined make up my identity. I didn't learn these all at once. I learned them over time, and I suspect that's true of most of us when we get around to figuring out who we are, the people we are. You become many things over time. But it's true that when you're trying to figure out who you are, sometimes the best place to start is to figure out who you're not. And here's who I'm not. I didn't turn out to be a tractor driver. Not a particularly good one anyway, though I certainly wanted to be one. Furniture mover wasn't the career for me. Certainly tried it a few times. Abstract expressionist artist, that came and went. Pro athlete, sure sounded good at about 8, maybe 10 years old. Didn't turn out to be the way it all worked. Not for lack of trying either. Commercial fisherman, not so much. Wasn't who I ended up being. Kid lawyer, boy, look at the knot on that tie. That never worked out either. Weather forecaster. That one didn't work either. But I have determined that if the sun is hot, that will lead me to be hot. So there's some cause and effect. Singer-songwriter? Meh, not so much. Won't be signing any CDs after today. Geology. It started off so well. I got the mica, the limestone, I'm rolling, and then all of a sudden it just didn't go much further from there. Fashion model? No. But look at the collar on that paisley shirt up top. Are you kidding me? You can watch a drive-in movie on that collar. Landscaper, college monkey, but wasn't my true calling. So if that's what I'm not, what am I? Well, I think the first thing I ever knew about myself is that I was a competitor. I think the first thing I ever learned about myself was that I like to compete and I like to win. Sports, quiz bowl, shooting pool for beer money, ping pong, you name it. If we were going to play it, I would just as soon win as not. Now, I'm mellowing a little bit over time. I think that's true. I don't let everything get to me now quite the way it used to. I'm willing to lose under the right circumstances. I once scored 49 points in a City League basketball game in Florida, and the only reason I remember it is because we lost the game. And I went home that night not thinking about, man, you did something you never did before. I went home that night thinking, why did we lose and what could I have done differently? I wanted to play. And I wanted to win. Even here, since I got here at UNCP, I've been a part of basketball and softball teams that won the intramural championship. Al Bryant's here, he can vouch for that. Now, I'm older and fatter, and that's probably not likely to happen anytime soon, just primarily because I'm old as dirt, but I still like to play. I learned if I was going to do something, I wanted to win. Now, there are admittedly limitations of that philosophy. It may not always be the best, but on balance, it's tended to serve me well. Our society is based on competition, and we can argue that it should or shouldn't be, but it is. And we have to exist in a competitive world. It's probably one of the first lessons that I ever learned about myself. Another thing I learned is that for me, I was going to be a person of faith. I learned by the time I was a teenager that I wanted to be a follower of Christ. Not because I wanted to follow other Christians, because I found them to be just as messed up as anybody else. Mostly because I came to believe that this Jesus was who he said he was. Now, my faith is surely not perfect, and I wouldn't ask anybody to think any more or any less of me because of it. And no, I don't have all the answers to the meaning of life. I'm not even sure if I have the right questions. But I did learn that part of who I am is related to what I believe. And here's the third thing I learned. That I wanted to be a writer, and eventually I was able to become a scholar. I learned early on how much I liked to write. I used to write summaries of the competitive games I played in as a kid, so everybody could make sure they had the right story of what happened. I looked forward to writing papers. This is going to sound odd. I'm really a little more normal than this. I looked forward to writing papers even in junior high school. Oh, you mean we got a paper to write? Cool. I've written poetry and short stories. I wrote for my college newspaper. I've written articles in history journals and essays. I've written technical manuals and short monographs. I wrote a long biography. I just finished this week finishing a book about the closing of a mill town in Alabama, 288 pages of love. I write because it's who I am, and it's how I've learned to communicate. I write at the risk of sounding pretentious, which I certainly don't want to be, because I love fried food like the rest of us. I write because I don't know how not to write. Writing and reading led me to grad school. Writing and reading led me to become a historian, and that's what got me here. And here's a little bit of my writing. I wanted to explore in the things that I've written as a scholar why Southerners do the things that we do. I wanted to ponder the inconsistencies of why, historically, we lead the country in going to church and at the same time lead the country in murder. I wanted to figure out why we're at the honky-tonk late into Saturday night, early into Sunday morning, and yet we roll into the house just in time to get changed and show up at church on Sunday morning. I was fascinated by those contradictions, and I still am. I'm fascinated by life in the South, by Southerners of all types, by the things that we do for each other, and unfortunately the things we do to each other. I am part of the South. It is where I am, it is where I will raise my children, it is where my research is, it is where I'll spend the rest of my life. And it's a source of wonderful inspiration. You see, to me it's the confusions and the contradictions that matter. The essential goodness of Southerners, which contrasts with our historical sins and conflicts that so fascinate me. How can we be so much of this, and yet at the same time be so much of that? One historian has referred to this as the Twoness of the South. How can we be so many different things at the same time? Historians write because the past and the present human condition in front of them overpowers us. Historians write because our thoughts drive us to the archives to find answers for questions that matter to us. And we sift through the documents and we talk to the people until the words get in our head, and then we don't sit still until we figure out a way to get the words out. You don't have to be disturbed to be a historian, though it might help. But if you're a historian and a writer and you don't write, I can promise you it will mess you up. Writing can make you lose track of reality, though. Again, you kind of get so focused on your own project that you forget there's a greater world around you. You get lost inside your project, and it's hard to find your way back out. Like the writer who came home one day from work and found out that his house had burned down. He parked his car and ran out and ran up, and there was his wife, and she was sobbing. "What happened, honey?" "Oh, John, it was terrible," she said. "I was cooking and the phone rang. It was your publisher. Because I was on the phone, I didn't notice that the stove caught on fire and the grease went everywhere. In a moment, the whole house went up and everything is gone. I nearly didn't make it out of the house." And he looks at her and said, wait a minute. My publisher called?" We get a little focused. There's three kinds of writing that I've done here. I've done the sort of traditional scholarly writing the books, the chapters that are in other people's books, the essays, the journal articles, the reviews, the critical essays that people ask you to write, refereeing the other scholarship where you write up what you think of other people's work, and that's pretty fascinating to do. Here's something that I published in 2012 right there. But I've also been captivated by other kinds of scholarly writing. There's a long tradition of historians providing scholarship for court cases. The best example in the field of Southern history, in the field of civil rights, is the work done in the Brown versus Board of Education decisions, much of which legally was provided, the legal research was provided by historians. It's a matter of some discussion, how important historians have been in providing the kinds of information, the kinds of scholarship, the kinds of writing that has led to the South being so fundamentally different now than it was 50 years ago, where frankly, 50 years ago, some of the people who are here today to sit through an hour of me could not have been allowed in this room, or rooms like this all over the South. So we've kind of done a relatively important thing. Now, the case that I worked on was the Lynch v. Alabama case, and it took me nearly 3 years of researching and writing and going in front of the courts and providing documents. It was a U.S. Federal District Court case, and eventually it made to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The key issue had to do with property taxes and political culture and discrimination. The legal issue was, were property tax assessed and collected in a way that discriminated in the state of Alabama based on race? In other words, did certain property get assessed at lower rates so that less money would be allocated for schools? Were those not accidents? Was that intentionally underfunded schools, particularly for African American minorities? This is some of the legal research and writing that I did on the Lynch case. This is one box of my stuff. In the end, the courts agreed with what I and others had said, that yes, it was intentionally discriminatory. They did not agree with our remedy of how to fix it. It may go to the Supreme Court. It may not. But it's gone as far as that's the last step. That is really cool. Now, what's an official review of your scholarship look like? Well, in my case, an official rule of the scholarship I did on that was 2 days of cross-examination by the former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, who had decided that I was wrong on the issues and wrong on the history and gave me 2 days of what for? That wasn't as cool. Now, there's another kind of writing that's an emerging field of academic history, and that's historians, academic historians, venturing into previously uncharted domain of historical fiction. And it's all over the conferences, it's all over the journals, it's all over the scholarly writing about the new role that historians are playing in taking their research and putting it into a format that ordinary citizens are more likely to consume. Why are academic historians increasingly starting the process of writing historical fiction? Well, first of all, academic presses are asking for it. They want to publish it because more people might be interested in taking our research and consuming it through alternative formats than are currently rushing out to the bookstore to order our monographs, which otherwise maybe aren't always the most popular books in town. The general public is interested in this. taught history in junior high or high school, at a certain point in time, you want to find out your identity, where you came from. History will matter to you. And the general public gets that. Historians work in this genre, but through exhaustive research. So what historians have decided in the last decade or so is that we can't always just fight non-historians who are writing about history. Maybe we have to switch. It's a new platform for taking our scholarship into the public square. Many who read historical fiction find the notes in the back and they say, I'd like to read a little bit more general history to find out what I think about some of the material that was just presented. It's a gateway to other scholarship that historians come up with. Now, the project that I've completed but haven't sent off to readers yet concerns a story about the South in 1975, the effective closing of a mill, something that North Carolinians can probably relate to as well, with the vast majority of textile mills that have closed in the last couple of decades. It's a blend of social, racial, political, and economic history, and it's based on several years of research material that I did about the South in the 1970s. It's just put in a new format. A format that historians are increasingly working in and that academic presses are publishing with increasing frequency. So, identity. Why do I write? Why am I interested in trying to be a part of a community of scholars? Well, it's who I am. It's what I want to do. It's important for my teaching. Those people that work actively in research find that they want to teach their classes in new and different ways. They're bringing documents into the classroom. They're bringing new perspectives. We find it so much easier to say things that we don't agree with just to provoke the discussion because we are more fluent in the material. And frankly, it's a commitment. Scholars are expected to commit to continuing to be engaged in the research and writing process. It's part of what we do. I really haven't mastered this clicker yet. Now, what else am I? I would say the next thing I learned about myself is that I'm a husband. I learned that you become something different when one becomes two, or maybe put a different way, when two decide to become one. I learned that you start to learn about sacrifice and caring from a different perspective. I learned that when you become a husband, it's hard to be self-absorbed because there's always someone there to read you back a little truth. Even if you don't always see eye to eye, what you get out of it is so much more than you could ever put in and so much more than you could ever imagine. Especially when you marry somebody whose outer beauty is only surpassed by who you've already decided she is inside. And I later learned that I'm a father. Pretty important part of my identity too. Little will change your life as much as becoming a parent, and nothing will scare you as much as you see your wife deliver the baby. They do all the things they do to it after the baby has just come out, and then they do the scariest thing you've ever imagined, which is they put you in a room and they hand you that baby, and you're not going to believe this, they walk out of the room then. What in the world are we supposed to do? We've only read 41 books on this. We have no idea what to do. You cannot be a good parent because you want to be one. It doesn't work that way. You cannot protect your children from hurt feelings. You cannot protect your children from any of 1,000 things that will shape them in the years that you have them. Because as much as you love them, you don't get to keep them with you every day. You find out soon that you have a world of responsibility and practically no power whatsoever. Parenting is harder than anything you'll ever do. Why? Because it affords you a real laboratory experiment to try all the things you've always thought about, but weren't sure were right. Because it results inevitably in you saying the one thing your parents said to you when you were a kid that you promised never to say. Parenting is more critical than anything else I can do with my time. Because the ultimate teachers are parents. Because here's what they have to teach first. They have to teach fairness. They have to teach kindness. They have to teach respect. They have to teach goodness. And they have to become the motivators for excellence. I wouldn't dream of telling any of you how to parent. It's too hard. And I wouldn't dream of suggesting that I know anything about it. It's too much a blend of art and science. There's no magic elixir. But I am convinced that you have to try to be good at parenting every day. And if you do try, it becomes part of your identity. It changes the way that you think. If you don't value children, you won't value parenting. And if that's true, we don't much value our future. Because all of us are going to be dependent on somebody else one day. And those people are the children we better be taking care of. If they bury me one day, and what they say is that I was a decent husband, and that I was a good father, then I lived my life the right way. And that's more than any other accomplishment, and with all due respect, more than even this award that I've received today. Because when that becomes a part of your identity, some of the other stuff that really used to matter, it matters a little bit. Now, my first main point is this. Find out who you are. Be happy to be who you are. Society certainly doesn't need you to be me. Society needs you to be you. And when you're you, whatever you decide that is, everybody else is better off. Find out who you are. Be happy to be who you are. Because the world needs all of us. The way we want to be. You want to know who you are? Well, if you're from the South, start by figuring out who your people are. And by that, if you're not from the South, it means who your family is. And then you try to decide whether you're running from them because you're scared of being like them, or when you're running to them because you want to be just like them. And at a certain point in time when you're figuring that out, you'll get some age on you and you realize it's both. That some of what you had growing up is exactly who you are and want to be. And in other ways, you want to stand your ground and plant your feet and decide to be something else. That's when you start to know who you are. At least it was for me. Now, my second point, simple. Do your best. In fact, believe it or not, there's a history of doing your best. It's an interesting study that can really span multiple centuries of American history. Some would date the concept of doing your best to the old Protestant work ethic, which Rears had in the colonial period with the Puritans and with other groups. There's certainly plenty of other roots in European thought as well as others, and indigenous ideas about this certainly as well. Others would see the culture of achievement in America as fashioned out of our thirst for materialism, out of social mobility. We want to do our best to keep up with the Joneses, or maybe to better the Joneses by rising above the crowd. The quest to do your best has got historical roots in this country. And people have noticed it for a long time. Way back to the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville came here and he said that America had a unique, quote, longing to rise. That Americans are constantly looking to get ahead. German sociologist Max Weber, in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, suggested that the cultural idea of doing your best is predicated on being a good steward of the skills you were given, of using your resources wisely. Weber suggested that some folks saw their success, if grounded in effort, merit, not heredity, if grounded in merit and perseverance as thrift, as an indication that you were living right. Calvin would have called it proof of election. Others would have had a variety of other perspectives. If you're getting ahead, if you're doing your best, you're probably doing it right. Now, much of this has been perverted with a variety of nonsensical racial and ethnic theories over time designed to marginalize one group at the expense of the others. Some have said only this group or that are capable of doing their best, of rising above. And I think that's, generally speaking, pretty much nonsense. But most of what historically we as Americans want to think about ourselves Most of how we look at ourselves and say, this is what I want to be, comes back to the common ground of trying to do your best. The rugged individualism of conquering or taming all that's in front of us. The self-motivation, our ability to persevere. It's grounded in what? In doing your best, in not quitting, in not giving up, of overcoming adversity, of a certain set of morality, of a meritocratic society where you get what you deserve. Everything we like to think about ourselves as Americans is largely predicated on trying to do your best. Now, it should be noted that America has not always done its best. We've had some moments that we probably would like to have back, including our less than moral behavior with regards to the treatment of American Indians. It's hard to say we built a perfect society given our history with slavery and segregation and disfranchisement and lynching, interning Japanese Americans in World War II camps and seizing their assets seems less than doing your best to be honorable. But with those caveats in place, let's summarize some of the benefits of doing your best. 1, doing your worst is decidedly less successful. As a strategy, attempting to do your very worst will consistently result in low performance. Those with low expectations, as Dr. Cook often reminds us, consistently reach them. Aim low. You'll hit the target. Believe it or not, a writer named Ray Bennett wrote a book called The Underachiever's Manifesto, the guide to accomplishing little and feeling great. The book's locked in at a grand total of 96 pages, because who has the time to read? Most systems of morality regard doing your best as an essential requirement for living in communion with either your God, your series of gods, or your fellow man. It's the right thing to do ethically, in other words, to do your best. In part because we're interconnected as people and as folks are depending on you. Fellow students depend on you. Fellow soldiers depend on each other. Neighbors, co-workers, employees, customers are predicated on somebody doing their best. Patients need the medical care that's provided for them to be the best. Look, if you own the company, you need the employees who work on the shop floor to work efficiently and productively. If you are on the shop floor, you want management to do its best to look out for you and care for you. We're interconnected, whether we like it or not. In fact, the quality of our lives depends on our collective commitment to doing our best. Who here wants the doctor about to operate on them to just give a ho-hum performance? Who here wants the military, when they go off to war, to try maybe once, but not try to keep trying? Want your favorite ball team, football, basketball, baseball, to mail it in when you're playing your big rival? I don't think so. If that's our expectation, then we can't offer mediocrity in what we do either. Doing your best doesn't necessarily mean being the best. Doing your best doesn't mean being the best. It means you're doing the best you can with the effort, intensity, and preparation that you can provide. My best is grossly insufficient for me to play in the NBA, something I learned a couple of decades ago. That has nothing to do with my ability to be the best writer, husband, or father that I can be. My best in calculus and physics, don't listen kids, wasn't really the best. It was only my best. An honest man's pillow is his peace of mind, John Mellencamp sang. It's true. Do your best and you'll sleep well at night. What's the risk of doing your best? Well, here's the risk. Foot one, you'll achieve. Good things will happen to you. You might take on too many challenges. You might make the world a better place. Do your best and you might occasionally get out of balance because you're so worried about doing your best at producing, you've forgotten to do your best at relaxing. Doing your best, you might reach your potential. You might focus on too many things that ultimately you decide aren't important. But you might end up happy because you figured out what your identity is and you tried to be good at it. You will invest your time in your own home, maybe, and in your own family, and your children will benefit. You'll try to do your best in your community, and you'll make it a better place. Yes, you'll internalize some pressure. But you'll learn to do your best and then to let that pressure go. Doing your best at whatever you want to be is your responsibility to the most important person in your life, yourself. Doing your best at what you want to be is the most important responsibility you have to yourself. My third and final point, be good. Be good to the people in your life. So far, I've simply tried to make 2 points. Find yourself. Figure out who you are. And it's fun. Whatever you want to be, you can be it today in a way that you probably never could have before. And to do your best in the things you do. But I think we also need to think about trying to be good. In his book, Moral Origins, an evolutionary anthropologist named Christopher Bain argues that morality might have originated out of the necessities of hunting, particularly the reality of what it took to hunt big game in millennia gone by. Bain speculates that people decided to cooperate with each other because they realized that our survival is predicated on each other. Doing good was the right thing to do. Out of this concept came a reduction in some measures of hierarchy, admittedly not all. It led to a growth in sharing, something that I think is pretty important for most societies. It led to what Bain argues is a rise in self-control. We learned to control our inhibitions a bit. We did good because it was our own self-interest. And then once we figured out it was our own self-interest, we realized it came with a lot of other benefits. Goodness becomes a requirement for a stable, functioning society. Goodness becomes part and parcel of providing sustainable, storable, replicatable food so that we can have time to create symbolism and culture and diversity and artistic expression, language and art grew out of doing good so that we could create some free time for ourselves. Most of the religious value systems in world history have had a set of morality-based principles for guiding behavior. Because almost no matter what you believe, virtually everybody believes we ought to do some good. The one we're most familiar with growing up in the South is the so-called Golden Rule, which actually reads, treat others the way you would like to be treated, not so much treat others the way they treated you first. Nobody said doing good was going to be easy. Value others the way you want to be valued. This is a root concept of society. I would say let people define through their own identity who they want to be and then be good to them. I think that's important. Henry David Thoreau once said, goodness is the only investment that never fails. You'll never feel bad about yourself when you do some good for somebody else. If this indeed was my last lecture, I believe I would beg those around me to dedicate themselves to trying to do some good. Do some good in your hometown. Do some good in your community. Do some good for somebody else. Do some good for somebody you care about, and do some good for somebody that you don't even know. Invest in each other with your goodness, I would say. And to be more specific, I would ask you to do good by doing one specific thing. And that is to find a way to serve. Serve because there's an interconnectivity to a university. Serve because we all have to serve who on our campus is today and ought to always be the most important group, our students. We don't have a place to work without them. Part of our mission should be to serve them in a variety of ways. Faculty serve various interests as well as navigating the fundamental divide between how much time we spend on our teaching and how much on our research. The staff here at this place allows the faculty to do the work that we're trained to do, and they provide a more pleasing and a more coordinated experience for our students. Administration plays a key role in planning for the physical and financial realities of allowing students to learn and faculty to teach. You see, there's interconnection. Each group, students, faculty, staff, and administration have to have respect for each other. We have to do some good for each other. When any one group takes themselves too seriously, the mission of the university suffers. When we don't dedicate ourselves to doing some good, this place isn't what it should be. It isn't what it can be. And it isn't what on our best days it usually is. There are so many ways to serve. Some nationally, some locally. A man was driving his car when he saw an older lady stranded on the side of the road. He saw that her car was no longer functioning and that she needed some help. He saw that her Mercedes was pulled over and wasn't functioning, so he pulled his old Pontiac off to the side of the road and smiled at her. "Looks like you need some help, ma'am. Can I help you?" Well, she didn't trust him very well because he was a little rough around the edges. He was a little dirty, his clothes were a little matted, his hair didn't look perfect. He was living life hard. "My name is Brian Anderson," although it could have been Ryan Anderson. "My name is Brian Anderson, ma'am, and I'd like to help you if you'll let me." And she said, "Okay." He found out the tire was flat, so he crawled under the car and he changed the tire. He got dirty, his hands were hurt, he was bleeding a little bit when he was done because we've all changed the tire that's a little more stubborn than we want it to be. When the job was done, she said, "How much do I owe you?" And Brian Anderson smiled and said, "If you really want to help pay me back, the next time you see somebody who needs something, do some good for them. And when you do, think of me." Well, that same evening, the lady stopped by a small cafe, and when her waitress came to take the order, the woman noticed that her waitress, was 8 months pregnant. The waitress had a sweet, friendly smile, and she was working awful hard to take care of people at all of her tables. The older lady wondered how someone was so little and so pregnant could be at work. And then she remembered Brian Anderson. She finished her meal and she paid with a $100 bill and she wrote a note on the check, "You don't owe me anything. Somebody once helped me and now I'm helping you. If you want to pay me back, do some good for somebody else." The waitress was thrilled at the tip, and then she opened the napkin where the note was and found 4 other $100 bills in it as well. That night, the waitress came home exhausted from her day. She was thinking about the lady and the money. She was thinking about the answer, about how that money would come in so well with having a baby, their first child. How could she have known that we needed the money so bad, she thought to herself. Eventually, her husband came home from working an extra shift himself. She greeted him, they kissed, and then she whispered, "You know what, Brian? Everything's going to be okay. Do a little good." I can't think of a single person who ever regretted time spent serving another person. I've experienced a tremendous amount of personal satisfaction from trying to do a little good. I've built a few handicap ramps, I've fed the homeless, I've re-roofed some houses for people who couldn't do it themselves. I've chopped and stacked some firewood for people who, believe it or not, in this county, in 2014, continue to heat their homes from burning wood. I've coached everything that you can coach in this town for youth, and I've done a fair amount of stuff for my students and for some other student groups at UNCP. And what I would say to you is none of that makes me any good. It doesn't make me any good. I would never be so pretentious as to claim that. All it means is I've done something. All it means is I've done something. And if this was my last lecture to ever give, that's what I would ask of you, is to find a way to do some good. Find somebody who needs something and help them. Not for what it will do for you, but because it's the right thing to do. Now, in conclusion, I'm not particularly sure how much you learned today. I hope you'll learn to find more ways to do good. The true measure of a man is not how we treat someone who can do something for him, but how we treat someone who can do him absolutely no good. Can you care for the people in your life who need you? Whoever they are, plant, animal, human. Can you care for them? Can you do some good? I don't know if you learned anything, but I would tell you today that you need to find out who you are. If you're one of my students, or if you're a student here and you're not sure who you are, man, that's why you're at this place. To figure out who you are and what you want to be. And we're here to help you. Americans are freer to be who they want to be than any time in our history. Be you. Be whomever you are. And do your best. Doing your best will come with rewards. Sometimes extrinsically. Sometimes you'll get a raise. Sometimes people will financially reward you for doing some good. But more importantly, you'll feel it inside. That matters. It matters to people to feel like they're contributing to someone else. Doing your best is more likely to be rewarded than any other time in American history. Keep doing it. And find a way to do some good. Be good to yourself by figuring out who you want to be and claiming it for yourself. Be good to your family, to your friends, to your strangers. Be good to your community. Be good to your region. Be good to your country. It's not old-fashioned. It's critical. And in classic Randy Pausch head fake, I hope my kids are listening. Because as much as this last lecture was an opportunity for me to say what I would always want to say to my students, if this was the last time I would talk to them, this lecture is just as much for my own 3 children. Find out who you are. Do your best. And be good to the people in your life. Thank you all for having me.
The last lecture is really an institution that has been adopted by many institutions across the United States. And it represents the great marriage between faculty and students. When I was backstage with Jeff before coming out, he said this is the most meaningful moment that he can recall because the students were the ones that chose him to speak. And I think you can understand by what he said today, that students are at the heart of what he does. And we are very, very proud to have Dr. Frederick representing the faculty this year as the winner of the last lecture. I want to thank all of you for coming here today, especially the students. I know there are a lot of student athletes out here today. And it just reflects what they feel about this man. But I think it also reflects how you feel about our faculty. And that's another reason that we do the last lecture. I want to thank you all for being here today. And I also want to invite any of you that would like to come up on stage and say hello to Dr. Frederick to feel free to do that. Let's give him one more round of applause.
I'll see you in 25 minutes. I'm going to run my office and take care of a few things.